However, unlike the Roman Empire, which completely collapsed under the attack and could not be rebuilt, the Five Hus entered China and embraced Chinese culture based on sedentary civilization and became part of a new central kingdom. After a century of great integration, the great empires of the Sui and the Tang dynasties, as a reconstruction of Qing and Han dynasties, encompassed more people, covered larger territories, and reached higher culture peaks.
Professor Wen argues that China is an essentially sedentary civilization in contrast to those of the West, which he defines as nomadic. He shows in a very comprehensive way how the need to constantly expand caused all of the great empires of Western classical antiquity to eventually run out of steam and collapse under their own weight. Watching this presentation, I was very inspired and reached out to Professor Wen to offer my own thoughts about the secret to Chinese civilizational longevity. Lucien Pai once remarked, quote, "In Western terms, the China of today is as if the Europe of the Roman Empire and of Charlemagne had lasted until this day and were now trying to function as a single nation state. I will argue that this analogy is based on a false premise of European civilizational continuity between the Roman and Holy Roman empires, and that a more accurate analogy would be to compare the China of today to the Roman Empire if it had managed to survive up until the present day." Let's begin our inquiry by looking more closely at Lucien Pai's curious expression, the Europe of the Roman Empire and of Charlemagne. The use of the conjunction "and" gives the impression that the Europe of the Roman Empire and the Europe of Charlemagne were two parts of a continuous European civilization. Let's look critically at this idea of a Holy Roman continuity, because the vast majority of historians dismiss this idea as a farce that was created as a kind of farce that was cooked up by the Holy Roman emperors themselves to legitimize their rule by connecting it to a great power, namely the Roman Empire. The most famous rejection of the Holy Roman continuity thesis was the philosopher and historian Voltaire, who wrote in 1751, quote, "This body which called and which still calls itself the Holy Roman Empire was in no way holy, nor Roman, nor an empire," end quote. Voltaire's analysis was very much on the money. First, he was correct to say that the Holy Roman Empire lacked holiness, as unlike the Roman Catholic Church, it was guided by exclusively secular policy-making considerations. Second, he was correct to say that the Holy Roman Empire lacked Romanness, as neither Charlemagne the Great nor any of his successors possessed a hereditary connection to the late Roman emperors. Being of Germanic stock, they would have been seen as barbarians by the Romans rather than as their spiritual heirs. Finally, the suggestion that the Holy Roman Empire was not an empire is often explained with reference to the times in which Voltaire was writing, shortly after the 30 Years' War, which saw a dramatic loss of power and prestige. Having shown that the pie analogy is based on a false premise of European civilizational continuity between the classical and medieval periods, let us now consider a reconstructed form of the analogy which compares the modern Chinese state to just if the Roman Empire had managed to survive to the present day. But it's important to distinguish between ancient Chinese civilization and modern China, the latter of which is associated with the founding of the first imperial Chinese dynasty, the Qin, in the 3rd century BC. It was founded by Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. This event and the subsequent founding of the first great imperial dynasty, the Han, shortly thereafter, occurred around the same time that the Romans were establishing themselves as the de facto imperial power in the Mediterranean basin. Both empires would survive for centuries, and comparative historians have noted a number of similarities between these two empires, but for our purposes, what's more important is examining the conditions of their collapse and what happened after. In the case of the Roman Empire, the collapse was permanent and irrevocable, whereas in the case of the Han Dynasty, the collapse was only a temporary situation that would be rectified in the 7th century by the Sui and Great Tang. The key to understanding how China was able to continually renew itself following a dynastic collapse is the region of China known as the Zhongyuan or Central Plains. This region may be known to Westerners as the agricultural heartland or breadbasket of Chinese civilization, the place that allowed for the ancient Huaxia nation to grow and expand. But what most Westerners do not understand about the Zhongyuan region is its parallel existence as a mythological core state of China. In Western terms, you would call it the axis mundi, or the center of the Chinese world. As the name implies, the ancient Chinese viewed the Zhongyuan region as a kind of representation of the pinnacle of human civilization, the place where humanity reached its most civilized state. And you could even say like it was seen as a kind of transitional zone between the lower terrestrial world and the higher celestial world, which the Chinese called Tian, or heaven. Indeed, in the 7th century, the link between the Zhongyuan and civilization was so strong that it was said that even an uncivilized barbarian, if they were to reside within the Zhongyuan region, would be transformed as though by magic into a civilized Chinese person. This doctrine, which became known as Yi Shi Bian Yi, or sinicizing the barbarians, was essential to the continuation of the Han Dynasty following its collapse, because it allowed the Sui and Tang to promote themselves as the successors to the Han, despite them not having pure Han ancestry, being of having maternal Turkic and Shanbei ancestry, and thus not being 100% Han Chinese. This doctrine allowed for a radical reinterpretation of what it meant to be Chinese from a racialist to a culturalist view, and in policy terms, it encouraged the migration of foreigners from all over the Asian world to the historic Tang capital of Chang'an. Indeed, in its heyday, Chang'an had residents from places as far afield as Persia, Central Asia, Vietnam, Tibet, Japan, India, all of whom were eager to renounce their native customs and adopt the ways of the Han. While this assimilation was largely successful, a byproduct of it was the diffusion of these barbarian spices throughout the Zhongyuan hot pot, which brought innovation, technology, and a general revival of Chinese civilization, which is even recognized today as the pinnacle of Chinese cultural perfection. The only problem with the purely geographic understanding of Chineseness, whereby one's proximity to the Zhongyuan determined whether or not you should be considered Chinese, is that it encouraged internal conflicts over who would have control of the Zhongyuan. After the Tang collapse in 907 AD, China was plunged into a period of internal turmoil known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, during which local warlords vied for control of the Zhongyuan region. The winners of this King of the Hill battle to control the Zhongyuan were the ethnically Han Song people, but they too were eventually defeated and displaced by nomadic invaders from the north known as the Jin or Jurchen, who established themselves in the Zhongyuan as the Northern Jin dynasty. This was a very important development in Imperial Chinese history, as it was the first time that a group of pure barbarians with no Han ancestry whatsoever achieved full control of the Zhongyuan. What was more concerning was that these barbarians had no desire, like the Tang emperors before them to renounce their native customs and learn the ways of the Han. On the contrary, the Jin rulers enacted laws to prevent their generals from intermarrying with the local Chinese women to try to preserve their haughty barbarian ways. Gradually, though, what occurred was a wearing down of the Jin as they succumbed to the allure of the advanced comforts and luxuries of the Chinese civilization, and they eventually became sedentary Chinese in their habits. This softening or wearing down of barbarian invaders would be repeated when the Mongol horde swept from the Eurasian steppe south into China in the 13th century, conquering the northern Jin and then finally the southern Song to achieve control over the entire Chinese mainland, which was an even more significant development since it was the first time that a group of barbarians had control of all of mainland China. This threatened to break the continuity of Chinese civilization since the Mongols had a strategy of breaking down their opponents by destroying their culture and essentially a form of psychological demoralization. However, the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan had a deep reverence for Chinese civilization, and instead of wiping it out, he instead renounced his own nomadic Mongol customs and promoted himself as a Chinese emperor, founding the Yuan dynasty and settling down to a sedentary style of existence that was characteristic of the Han culture. The period of Chinese history from the fall of the Tang dynasty in 907 to the founding of the Mongol Yuan dynasty in 1271 was the period when the entity that Lucian Pye calls the China of today was born. The key feature of the China of today, as opposed to the traditional China associated with the northern Zhongyuan region, is the fact that the China of today has not one but two distinct centers. The northern political and administrative center, located in the Zhongyuan region, namely in Hebei province with the capital of Beijing, and the southern economic center that historically has been associated with the coastal provinces of Guangdong and Fujian. The emergence of the latter as a distinct center of Chinese civilization can be traced to the southern migration of the Song and their reconstitution as the Southern Song following their loss to the Jin. The informal association of the Song with southern China was formalized by the Mongol Yuan dynasty after defeating the Song, giving the defeated Song the derogatory title of Southerners to denote their position at the bottom of the Chinese social hierarchy. This designation seems logical when you consider that in a social hierarchy, the northern position would typically be seen as the best, and to be in the south would be associated with being at the bottom of a hierarchy. However, the effect of this association was that it radicalized the Song against not only the Mongols, but against the traditional superstitious idea that one's geographic proximity to the Zhongyuan region determined how civilized or Chinese one was. The anti-traditional view of the Song was given doctrinal support by the emergence of what was called Young Mingism, also known as the School of the Heart, in Fujian province during the Song dynasty in opposition to the northern rationalistic school of Neo-Confucianism. The distinctly southern political consciousness was strengthened still further by the rise of the Qing Manchus in 1636, who continued the Mongol practice of looking down on and disparaging the Southern Chinese, and who were in turn ridiculed by the Southerners as uncompromising, rigid bureaucrats with a limited understanding of Chinese culture. This stereotyping of Northerners and Southerners remains a feature of Chinese cultural life even to this day, with Northerners ridiculing Southerners as being materialistic, skeptical, intelligent, cunning, and superficial, and the Southerners in turn ridiculing the Northerners as being simple-minded, naive, and overly orthodox and traditional. The North-South split, even though it was a source of internal division within China, was paradoxically what allowed it to defend itself as a unified civilization against the European imperialists who would arrive in southern China in the 18th century. At this time, the stereotype of the Qing Manchus as excessively rigid and uncompromising was on full display in their early diplomatic encounters with the Europeans, refusing to deal with the latter as their diplomatic equals, despite them having clear military and technological superiority. While the Qing emperors have been viewed very critically by posterity for this, it's important to keep in mind that at this point in Chinese history, they had been successfully managing barbarian invaders for over 500 years, and so had reason to be somewhat confident. However, when it became clear that the European sea barbarians, as they were called by the Qing, could not be dealt with using the same strategies that had worked against the land barbarians of the past, they reluctantly conceded that new strategies were necessary. The Qing oversaw the strategic relinquishment of territorial sovereignty in specific coastal cities along the southern and eastern coastline of China. This was a strategy to ensure that the Europeans did not attempt to penetrate further into the interior of China and occupy the sacred Zhongyuan region. If the Qing can be considered the architects of this strategy, the treaty port system, its day-to-day administrators were undoubtedly the southern Chinese who became known as the treaty port Chinese, whose antinomian interpretation of Neo-Confucianism allowed them to exist alongside the Europeans and even to serve them as compradors or economic middlemen, whilst still retaining a sense of patriotism by virtue of the fact that they were the hereditary descendants of the Han dynasty. As a result of this strategy, which the historian John King Fairbanks writes, quote, was not merely a Western device for bringing China into the Western world. It may equally well be viewed as a Qing device for, quote, bridling and reining in Qi Mi, the powerful sea barbarians, end quote. As a result of this strategy, China was able to limit the cultural influence of the Europeans from the 1840s right up until the end of Imperial China in 1912. The treaty ports functioned almost like containment zones for the Westerners and ensured that the Zhongyuan region would remain pure and unsullied by foreign occupation. In this presentation, I've argued that the secret to Chinese civilizational continuity has been its preservation of the trans-dynastic Zhongyuan region, the birthplace of Chinese civilization, which amazingly has never once been occupied by a foreign power. The reason for this, as we have seen, is that in times of external threat, the Chinese invested the Zhongyuan with magical properties, namely the ability to transform barbarian invaders into civilized Chinese. We've also seen how the emergence of southern China as the economic powerhouse it is today was born of a rejection of this superstition whereby one's proximity to the Zhongyuan determined how civilized or Chinese one was. Ironically, though, the southerners who rejected the Zhongyuan myth did the most to defend it against the European imperialists who arrived in China in the 18th century. By serving the Europeans as compradors in the treaty ports, the southern Chinese were able to preserve the Zhongyuan region until the collapse of Imperial China in 1912.
姐妹们总烦恼脸上细纹、干燥与暗沉，现在起跟我一起放心交给 KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹系列，它添加5种 EGF， 专门防止肌肤老化。强化皮肤修复，增加肌肤弹性水嫩，轻松抚平皱纹，换回青春自信。KS Royal Face 皇家颜值逆时奇迹，活肤露、全效精华、精华霜，即刻启动冻龄密码。